Hey guys, tonight we begin with a mountain man trying to make a room out of winter. Not a cabin. At least, not at first. Not the neat little log house you might picture from a painting, with smoke curling politely from the chimney and a warm yellow window glowing in the trees. More often, the first shelter was much smaller than that. It was a hollow beside a fallen trunk. It was a few poles dragged into place before the light failed. It was a skin, a blanket, a wall of spruce boughs, a dark opening under a rock ledge, or a low reef of branches that did not so much defeat the cold as persuade it to slow down for a few hours. Imagine the evening coming early in the Rocky Mountains. The sky has that pale iron colour it gets before hard weather. Snow has crossed it over where the wind has scraped it flat, and in the hollows it lies soft and deep enough to swallow a careless step. Your boots, or moccasins, or worn-out foot wrappings are stiff at the edges. The leather has frozen where it was wet, then softened near your body, then frozen again. Your fingers are not useless yet, but they are becoming clumsy in the way cold makes everything slightly foolish. A knot that would be easy at noon becomes a personal insult at dusk. A strap will not pull. A buckle will not listen. Even the axe handle feels as if it belongs to somebody else. And somewhere in that lowering light, before the stars come out sharp enough to hurt, a choice has to be made. Where will the night go? That question was not romantic, it was practical, and it came before almost everything else. Mountain men, trappers, hunters, voyageurs, and winter travellers across the western fur trade did not survive cold by simply being tough. Toughness helped, of course, but toughness by itself is a very poor blanket. What mattered was judgment, repeated in small decisions. Where the wind was coming from, whether there was dry fuel nearby, whether water could be reached without stumbling through the dark, whether snow could insulate instead of smother, whether a horse or mule needed shelter too, whether the ground would drain, whether there were tracks that suggested trouble, and whether the body had enough strength left to build anything more ambitious than a miserable little windbreak. Tonight, we are not going to turn this into a survival manual or a heroic frontier poster. We are going to move slowly through the colder truth that shelter in the mountains was often temporary, smoky, cramped, and unfinished. It was built from whatever the place allowed. It borrowed from indigenous knowledge, from old travel habits, from fur trade necessity, from trial and error, and from the plain fact that a man who misread the weather might not get a second chance to feel embarrassed about it. If this kind of quiet history helps you settle in, you can like the video and subscribe for more slow journeys into the small human details that big history often leaves out. No pressure at all, just a gentle way to keep these night stories coming. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing to understand is that a shelter began before anyone touched a branch. It began with looking. A tired man coming into camp did not just see trees. He saw fuel, windbreak, bedding, roof poles, smoke problems, animal cover, and the difference between a place that felt comfortable for 5 minutes and a place that might keep him alive until morning. A grove of timber near water could be welcome, but not every grove was friendly. Low ground could hold cold air like a bowl. A beautiful open meadow might give easy movement and a clear view, but it might also let the wind come across it all night with nothing to slow it down. A dense stand of spruce or pine might catch snow in its branches and soften the wind, but if the trees were too tight, the fire might smoke badly, and dead limbs overhead could become their own quiet hazard. The old decision was not. Where is the perfect place? The old decision was, what problem can I live with tonight? By the early 19th century, many men working the western fur trade had learned, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly, from native peoples whose shelters were shaped by generations of local knowledge. That knowledge was not one thing. A skin lodge on the plains was not the same as a brush shelter in timbered country, and neither was the same as taking cover in a cut bank, a cave mouth, or a snowbank. Materials changed from valley to valley, so did customs, weather, animals, and the rhythm of travel. But the larger lesson was steady. Shelter was not a single object. It was a relationship with place. A man in winter might look for the leeward side of a ridge, the downwind side of a thicket, or a patch of timber where snow had not drifted too deeply. If he had animals, he might need grass or browse nearby, and that could pull him toward places less comfortable for himself. If he had companions, they could build more. If he was alone, every improvement had to be paid for by his own arms in the dark. That is one of the quiet truths behind frontier shelter. Comfort was not free. A better roof meant more cutting. More cutting meant sweat. Sweat in winter could be dangerous once the work stopped and the dampness cooled against the skin, so the body became part of the architecture. You did not build only with wood. You built with the heat you could afford to lose. You built with the time left before night. You built with the dryness of your socks, the strength in your wrists, the sharpness of your knife, the condition of your blanket, and the mood of the weather coming over the ridge. The shelter was not separate from the man. It was a measurement of him. A common emergency answer was a lean-to, though the word can make it sound cleaner than it was. In its simplest form, it might be a sloping wall of poles and branches angled against a support, a fallen tree, a ridgepole lashed between trunks, or a rough frame made in haste. Pine or spruce boughs could be layered over it, with the tips angled downward to shed snow or at least slow it. If there was a hide, a robe, a blanket, or a piece of canvas, that might be stretched along the frame. Though cloth in hard weather had its own complaints. It could stiffen. It could collect frost. It could flap. It could leak where smoke and sparks had made their little arguments with it on previous nights. The lean-to's great virtue was that it gave the wind something to hit besides your back. Its great failure was that it was only half a room. The open side faced the fire, and the fire had to do the work that the missing wall could not. This made the fire both friend and demanding employer. It needed wood, not one cheerful armload, but a night's worth, and then more than that, because cold eats fuel with a steady appetite. A man might build a long fire in front of the opening, feeding it with larger logs laid lengthwise so that heat washed back toward the shelter. Sometimes a reflecting wall of logs or stones could be arranged beyond the fire, throwing warmth back toward the sleepers. But every improvement added labour. Every clever arrangement still had to be cut, dragged, stacked, and tended by someone whose hands were already cold. And smoke, of course, had opinions. Modern imagination tends to give old campfires a friendly glow. In practice, smoke could be a nightly nuisance, a punishment, a companion, and sometimes the only reason insects, dampness, and misery seemed to retreat. In a low shelter, if the wind shifted, smoke rolled inward and filled the little space where a man was trying to breathe. It found eyes. It found blankets. It found damp wool and stayed there. The smell of wood smoke was not just atmosphere. It got into hair, hide, skin, bedding, food, and memory. A mountain man did not need a dramatic scar to be marked by winter. He could smell like last night's poor ventilation. Still, when the cold pressed hard enough, the smoky shelter was better than a beautiful open sky. Inside, the ground mattered almost as much as the roof. To sleep directly on frozen earth, ice, or packed snow was to let the warmth drain downward out of the body. Pine boughs, grass, hides, robes, saddle blankets, and whatever else could be spared became bedding, insulation, and sometimes the difference between real rest and a long night of turning from one ache to another. The bough bed was not a luxury mattress. It could poke, crackle, sag, and shed needles into clothing, but it lifted the body slightly away from the frozen ground and made a small pocket of human possibility. This is where the old pictures often lie by omission. They show the shelter from outside, where it can look picturesque. They do not show the man inside, trying to decide whether the side of his body facing the fire is too hot, while the side facing the wall is still cold. They do not show him waking because a foot has slipped off the bedding. They do not show him reaching from under a robe to pull a reluctant piece of wood closer to the coals. They do not show the stiff boot waiting in the dark like a small enemy. But that is where the real history is, not in conquest, in adjustment. A winter shelter was an argument with discomfort conducted in small movements. Pull the robe tighter, shift the shoulder, feed the fire, knock snow off the edge, wake because sparks have jumped, wake because the fire has fallen, wake because the wind has found the one gap you were too tired to fill. Lie still for a while and listen to the timber creak. Decide whether getting up is worth it. Decide again 10 minutes later, when the cold has become more persuasive, and outside, the shelter sits low against the dark, almost invisible except for the breathing orange line of the fire. Snow gathers on the branches. Smoke crawls along the roof and escapes in loose threads. A half-burned log settles inward with a soft collapse, sending up a brief flicker of sparks. For a moment, the whole poor little structure appears. Poles, boughs, blanket edge, frozen ground, one man's tired hand reaching toward warmth. It is not much of a room, but in that winter, in that place, with night coming down over the mountains, it may be enough. The small mercy of a shelter like that was that it did not have to be beautiful. It only had to interrupt the night. By morning, if the man had chosen well, the worst of the wind had gone around him instead of through him. The fire might be tired, reduced to a low red seam under grey ash. The boughs under his hip might be flattened and damp. The smoke might have made his eyes sore, but he had crossed the dark hours, and for a winter traveller, that was not a small thing. Shelter was counted in mornings. A bad one left a man shaking, slow and bitter before the day even began. A good one gave him just enough warmth to stand, curse quietly at his boots, and begin again. In the mountain trade, movement shaped almost everything. A man who was trapping beaver along icy streams could not always build as if he meant to stay. His work followed water, animals, weather, and sometimes the decisions of a company, a brigade, or a small group of partners. He might spend time in a more established winter camp, but he also needed ways to sleep between places, on short notice, under changing skies. That is why the shelter of the mountain man often seems unfinished to us. It was not always meant to be finished. It was a tool, like a trap or an axe, made for a particular use, then left behind when the next creek, valley, or trail demanded him. This is one of the quiet differences between a house and a winter shelter. A house asks the future to come in and sit down. A winter shelter only asks the present to be slightly less dangerous. Sometimes, if there was time and reason, men built rough cabins. These could range from crude huts to more substantial log structures, depending on the location, the season, the available tools, and how long a party expected to remain. A wintering camp connected to the fur trade might include cabins, storehouses, animal shelters, or other practical structures. Logs could be notched and stacked. Gaps could be chinked with mud, moss, grass, or whatever material could block drafts. A roof might be made of poles covered with earth, bark, or branches. The result could be warmer than a lean-to and far more protective in long storms. But even a cabin was not the cosy certainty our minds tend to build. A rough winter cabin could be dark, crowded, smoky, and alive with drafts. If there was no proper chimney, smoke could linger under the roof before finding its way out through a hole or a poor opening. If the chinking failed, wind threaded through the walls in thin, invisible blades. If the floor was only earth, dampness rose. If the men inside had been travelling, trapping, skinning animals, drying gear, cooking, repairing tools, and sleeping in the same space, the air would carry many histories at once. There would be wet leather near the fire. There would be hides, traps, powder horns, knives, spare moccasins, blankets, saddles, robes, and food stores if fortune had allowed. There might be the smell of meat, grease, smoke, unwashed wool, animal hair, pine pitch, and old snow melting from clothing. A cabin could save a man from the wind and still make him very aware of other people. Privacy was a luxury with no room to stand up. One man's damp socks became everyone's atmosphere. Yet a cabin, however crude, gave something a temporary shelter could not, a sense that the weather had to knock before entering. Even if it entered anyway through the cracks, the wall made a difference. A stacked log wall changed the mind. It gave the body permission to loosen slightly. The shoulders could come down. The hands could open. Men could mend gear, cook more steadily, sleep longer, and let animals rest nearby. In deep winter, that kind of steadiness was not comfort in the modern sense. It was maintenance. It kept people from being worn down too quickly. For men moving through timbered country, another common answer was the brush shelter, sometimes scarcely more than a dense windbreak built against the weather side of camp. Branches could be woven or leaned together. Snow could be banked along the bottom to seal gaps, if the snow was right for it. A blanket or hide might be used to close part of the opening. The key was not to make a perfect wall, but to stop the wind from stealing heat faster than the fire, and the body could replace it. Wind mattered, because cold alone was not the whole enemy. A still, cold night could be endured with enough insulation and fire. Wind changed the arithmetic. It pushed smoke sideways. It drove snow into bedding. It stripped warmth off exposed skin. It found sleeves, collars, seams, and the gap between blanket and ground. The mountain man's shelter, therefore, was often arranged less around elegance than around direction. The back faced the wind. The open side faced the fire. Bedding was tucked where sparks were less likely to land, but warmth could still reach. Tools were kept where they could be found in the dark. A man did not want to wake at midnight and have to search in snow for the thing needed to keep the fire alive. That need for order could be surprisingly strict in a place that looked disorderly. A rough camp might seem chaotic to an outsider, but the experienced traveller knew where the axe lay, where powder must stay dry, where moccasins should be kept from freezing solid, and how far a blanket could be trusted near sparks. Cold punished forgetfulness. It also punished pride. A man who tossed gear aside because he was exhausted might discover before dawn that the little act had become a large problem. Moccasins and boots deserve their own quiet respect here. Footwear in winter was shelter too, only smaller. If it froze hard, the morning became a struggle before the first step. Some men slept with damp items near their bodies, unpleasant as that sounds, to keep them from turning rigid. Others dried gear near the fire and risked scorching it. Leather could shrink, stiffen, crack, or burn. A sock or wrapping that was merely uncomfortable at sunset could become a genuine threat after hours of cold. The shelter around the man had to protect the shelter around his feet. In snowy country, snow itself could become part of the building, not always in the clean, block-cutting way people imagine from far northern snow houses, which belong to different environments and different traditions, but snow could be shoveled, banked, packed, or used as insulation around brush, logs, and bedding. Drifted snow against the windward side of a shelter could seal the lower cracks. A pit scraped down through snow to ground level might give a little relief from wind. A trench, a bank, or a hollow near trees could change how air moved. Snow was dangerous when it soaked clothing, collapsed overhead, or hid bad ground, but in the right place, it could be a wall made by weather itself. Still, snow sheltering required care. Too much confidence could make a man careless. Wet snow could chill. Powder could blow through every opening. A thaw followed by a freeze could cross the camp into discomfort. And when fire entered the picture, the neatness of snow vanished. Heat melted edges. Meltwater ran where it pleased. Steam rose. Bedding dampened. A shelter that looked clever at dusk might become a cold little swamp by morning. So the men adjusted. They built slightly higher. They cut drainage. They moved bedding. They fed the fire from one side. They accepted that every shelter was a bargain with consequences. The more you sit with this history, the less shelter looks like a structure, and the more it looks like a chain of negotiations. Do you use the last good daylight to cut more wood or improve the roof? Do you spend strength dragging a larger log for steady heat, or save your body for tomorrow's travel? Do you close the shelter tighter and risk smoke, or leave it open and lose warmth? Do you camp near water and risk colder air? Or climb higher and melt snow instead? None of these questions has one perfect answer. Each belongs to a particular night. And that is why the coldest winters did not create one grand frontier method. They created habits of attention. They taught men to notice the bend of grass under snow, the sound of wind in different trees, the dryness of standing dead wood, the way smoke behaved before a storm, the difference between a shelter that looked snug and one that breathed just enough. They taught that comfort could be dangerous if it made a man stop thinking, and misery could be useful if it kept him awake to small repairs. Somewhere in the dark, the fire log shifts again. A line of sparks rises, flickers, and disappears into the low roof smoke. Beyond the shelter, the snow keeps falling without hurry. Inside, a man wakes, listens, and waits to see whether the wind has changed its mind. A changed wind could make a man feel as if the entire mountain had turned over in its sleep. The shelter that seemed sensible at dusk might begin to mutter before midnight. A low hiss through the branches, a soft patter of snow shaken loose from the roof, a sudden push of air that drove smoke into the opening and made the sleeper turn his face into a blanket. Nothing dramatic had to happen. No tree had to fall. No wolf had to step into the firelight. The ordinary movement of weather was enough to remind a winter traveller that he had not built a home. He had borrowed a corner of the night. That borrowing was easier when the materials were generous. In timber, the mountains offered poles, brush, needles, bark, resin, and sometimes standing deadwood dry enough to burn well if a man knew what to look for. But even in a forest, there was no automatic abundance. Snow could bury the useful pieces, green wood could smoke and sulk, rotten wood could crumble under the axe. A fallen log might be too heavy to move, too wet to burn, or placed so badly that getting it would cost more strength than it gave back in warmth. Experienced men learned to read wood almost the way they read tracks. A branch snapped clean might promise dryness. Wood that broke with a dull, sponge-like sound had already surrendered to rot. Bark loosened by age might shelter drier material beneath. A standing dead tree could be a gift, though not always a safe one. The axe had to be used with judgment, because a winter camp did not forgive a careless cut. A wound, a broken tool, or a lost edge could shrink the world quickly. The axe itself was one of the quiet rulers of shelter. With it, a man could make a ridgepole, trim branches, split fuel, notch cabin logs, chop through ice, or drive stakes into frozen ground if the soil allowed. Without it, everything became slower, poorer, more dependent on what had already fallen. A knife could do much, and a good knife was precious, but a knife did not turn timber into shelter with the same authority. Tools changed the kind of night a person could hope for. Still, even with an axe, work in winter had a rhythm that had to be respected. Swing too hard for too long and heat rose under the clothing. That might sound welcome until the sweat cooled. A man could become damp inside his own layers, while snow stayed dry on the outside. Then, once he stopped, the warmth he had made turned against him. This is why winter labour often demanded a strange restraint. Build quickly, but not wildly. Work hard, but not blindly. Stay warm, but try not to soak yourself from within. It was a balance more delicate than the heroic drawings suggest. The old clothing helped, but it also had limits. Wool could keep some warmth even when damp, and animal hides or robes could be life-saving. Fur, buckskin, blankets, capotes, mittens, and leggings all belonged to the winter body, each with its own virtues and failures. But clothing was not a magic wall. Seams leaked cold, snow clung to fringe and hems, damp leather stiffened. A robe near the fire could become too hot on one side and cold on the other. A man might smell of smoke because smoke followed him everywhere, but smell did not mean warmth had settled in. This is why bedding was treated seriously before sleep. If strength remained, a man might lay down boughs with more care than a modern listener expects. Spruce, pine, fir, cedar, or other available branches could be arranged with stems downward and softer ends upward, forming a springy layer that trapped a little air and lifted the body away from the cold floor. The exact plant depended on region. The principle did not. Earth steals heat. Snow steals heat. Stone steals heat. A body lying flat in the wrong place is a small stove with no fuel supply, losing warmth into whatever is underneath. A good bough bed had a smell. Resinous, green, sharp, almost clean under the smoke. It also had a sound, a faint crackle when weight settled into it. The first few minutes might feel almost luxurious after a day of travel. Then the sharper stems made themselves known. A knot pressed the hip. A boot heel slipped. A branch sprang up near the neck with the confidence of an enemy. But even an imperfect bed could be the difference between sleeping and merely waiting for morning. If there were hides, buffalo robes, bearskins, or trade blankets, the shelter changed again. A robe could be bedding, cover, door, curtain, windbreak, or emergency wrap. Buffalo robes especially were prized in many Western contexts, and they mattered deeply in winter travel. But they were heavy, bulky, and not always available. They also carried the larger world of trade, hunting, native exchange, and animal labour into the small space of the camp. Nothing in the shelter was just an object. Every item had a history attached to it. Who made it? Who traded it? What animal had provided it? What trail had worn it down? What storm had soaked it before? The mountain man's shelter, then, was also a bundle of relationships. Even when he looked alone beside the fire, he was not entirely alone in what kept him alive. His blanket might come through trade networks reaching far beyond the valley. His method of pitching cover might owe something to native companions, wives, guides, or neighbours whose knowledge rarely received the same loud memory in frontier storytelling. His tools might have crossed oceans before they cut Rocky Mountain timber. His powder, kettle, awl, and cloth all carried the fingerprints of a world larger than the lonely scene. That is one of the reasons the simple phrase "living off the land" can mislead. Yes, winter shelter used local materials. Yes, the man had to know the trees, snow, slope, water, and wind. But he also lived through trade goods, borrowed techniques, shared habits, and the labour of people whose names were often not preserved with equal care. A low brush shelter in the snow might look like pure self-reliance from a distance. Up close, it was more complicated and more honest than that. Sometimes the most important part of shelter was what it allowed a man to protect. Dry powder, for one thing, could not be treated casually. Food stores, if he had them, had to be kept from animals and damp. Traps needed attention. Metal could freeze to wet skin. A rifle or gun had to be kept serviceable. Needles, awls, and thread mattered because torn clothing could become a cold injury waiting politely for the next storm. In that cramped winter space, shelter was not only for sleep. It was a workshop, kitchen, drying room, storeroom, and argument with the weather. Picture him sitting near the entrance after dark, not fully inside and not fully out, because the fire demands closeness and the smoke punishes it. He holds a moccasin in both hands, turning it toward the heat, trying to dry it without cooking the leather into ruin. Beside him, a strip of meat warms. A tin cup or small kettle rests where it can be watched. Snow taps softly against the outer boughs. The roof settles lower under its white weight. He has perhaps made worse shelters before, and better ones, too. This one is neither victory nor failure. It is tonight's answer. That modesty is easy to miss. We want old survival to be dramatic, full of decisive acts and brilliant tricks. Much of it was instead a patient avoidance of small disasters. Do not let the fire die all at once. Do not sleep with wet feet if there is any way around it. Do not put the powder where melting snow can find it. Do not trust a branch roof too heavily loaded. Do not waste dry wood early, because the long hours after midnight are colder than pride expects. Do not assume that because you have slept outdoors before, this particular night owes you anything. By the time deep night settles, the shelter has become a kind of listening device. It catches the wind and translates it into creaks, taps, sighs, and sudden flutters. The man inside learns the shape of the weather by sound. Snow slipping from a branch, coals collapsing, a horse stamping somewhere beyond the glow, the small, dry tick of a spark landing on bark, the blanket edge lifting when air finds a gap. Every sound asks the same soft question: leave it or get up? And most of the time, tired as he is, he waits a moment before answering. When he did get up, the movement was careful and reluctant, the way a person moves when the body has finally made a treaty with warmth and hates to break it. The first reach was usually toward the fire, not the sky, not the trees, not the grand landscape waiting under moonlight. Just the fire, low and stubborn, because the camp had narrowed to that dull red pocket of survival. A man might push one half-burned log inward with a boot or a stick, then pause while sparks climbed through the smoke and vanished against the dark roof of branches. He might add a split piece of dry wood, if he had one, or a green branch that would hiss, spit, and complain before it agreed to burn. If the wind had shifted, he might drag a chunk of wood to one side, rebuilding the shape of heat without ever naming the act as architecture. That is one of the quiet beauties of these shelters. They were never finished in the way a house is finished. They were adjusted through the night, a branch stuffed into a gap, a robe pulled lower, a snowbank pressed tighter against the outside, a coal rescued from ash, a smoky opening widened with a curse. The real shelter was not only the frame built at dusk, it was the whole sequence of waking, noticing, repairing, and settling again. For men in the Rocky Mountain fur trade, nights like this belonged to a larger pattern of movement and waiting. Trapping demanded attention to waterways, even when those waterways were armoured with ice. Beaver, the animal at the centre of so much labour and trade, drew men into cold valleys, willow-choked streams, marshy edges, and places where dampness seemed to rise from below even when snow was falling from above. A dry camp on higher ground might feel better, but work pulled people down toward water. The very landscape that promised profit could make shelter harder. Water was useful, dangerous, and inconvenient all at once. Camp too far from it, and snow had to be melted, which meant more fuel and more time. Camp too close, and the cold settled near the creek bed. Ice could crack underfoot. Wet brush could soak leggings. A man checking traps might return with clothing stiffening in the evening air. The shelter then had to receive him not as a clean figure from a painting, but as a damp, tired worker, bringing half the creek home on his legs. The work itself followed him inside. Traps might need repair. Chains, springs, and jaws had to be kept functioning. Metal in winter has a discouraging honesty. It does not care how tired a person is. It bites cold into the fingers. It stiffens with ice. It becomes awkward when touched through mittens and painful when touched without them. In the small glow of the fire, a man might hold a trap close enough to thaw a little ice, then pull it back before the metal grew too hot or wet. Shelter was not just where he slept. It was where the tools of tomorrow were persuaded not to betray him. Food also changed the meaning of shelter. A well-fed man builds differently from a hungry one. That may sound simple, but it matters. Cutting poles, gathering fuel, dragging logs, clearing snow, and tending animals all cost strength. If supper was thin, the shelter might be thinner too. If meat was available, if a kettle could simmer, if grease could be added, if there was coffee or tea or some small traded comfort, the whole camp felt more possible. Heat inside the body and heat outside the body worked together. One without the other was never enough. Cooking in such a place was often smoky, awkward, and close to the ground. A piece of meat might roast on a stick or lie near the coals. A kettle might hang from a simple pole arrangement or sit beside the fire, its contents warming unevenly. Snow could be melted into water, though anyone who has done it knows how disappointing a pot full of snow can be when it collapses into a shallow drink. The work required patience. More snow, more fuel, more waiting. The body asks for warmth quickly. But the camp answers slowly, and if there were several men, the shelter became social in ways both helpful and irritating. More hands could cut more wood, more bodies gave warmth, more eyes could watch animals and weather. But more people also meant more smoke breathed, more damp gear, more elbows, more opinions about the fire, and more chances for one man's poor judgment to become everyone's problem. A low winter shelter did not encourage graceful manners. It encouraged negotiation by grunts, shifting shoulders, and the ancient politics of who had rolled too close to the warm side. The social world of mountain men was never as simple as the lone figure in buckskin. Some travelled or wintered in parties. Some had native wives and families. Some depended on native communities, mixed communities, trading posts, company supply lines, guides, interpreters, and partners whose labour has often been flattened in popular memory. Shelter knowledge moved through these relationships. A man might learn how to pitch a skin or cloth to shed wind better, how to use boughs in a particular country, how to bank snow without inviting meltwater, how to read the safer side of a grove, or how to protect horses from a storm. These lessons did not always arrive as formal instruction. They arrived by watching, failing, being corrected, and surviving long enough to remember. It is worth pausing with that, because the frontier myth likes a clean hero. The real camp was crowded with debts. A blanket from one market, a robe from another exchange, a knife forged far away, a horse bred and traded through many hands, a shelter habit borrowed from someone whose name may not have been written down. The man in the shelter may feel alone at midnight, and in one sense he is. But the shelter itself is not lonely. It is full of other people's knowledge. Outside the firelight, animals added their own quiet pressure. Horses and mules could be as necessary as tools. They carried gear, robes, traps, food, and sometimes the possibility of getting out at all. In winter, they needed feed, protection from wind when possible, and some attention against cold and exhaustion. A man might choose a camp partly because animals could paw through snow for grass or find some browse. That choice might make his own shelter less comfortable, but losing an animal could be worse than a cold night. The camp was therefore arranged around more than human sleep. It had to hold a small, fragile economy of bodies. Sometimes animals stood beyond the glow, shifting and snorting softly, their breath pale in the dark. A horse might stamp, tug at a line, or turn its hindquarters to the wind with more wisdom than its owner wanted to admit. Snow collected along its back, frost gathered at the muzzle. The mountain man's shelter, low and smoky as it was, sat within that larger circle of dependence. The man warmed himself, the animals endured, the fire burned, the gear dried. The weather pressed around all of them with equal patience. The cold did not care about rank, reputation, or the stories later told in saloons and books. It entered through bad seams, it followed wet cuffs, it crept under bedding. It made the proud and the foolish do the same small chores as everyone else. Feed the fire, shake off snow, dry the leather, turn the meat, check the animals, keep the powder safe, find the axe before it is buried. In that sense, winter was a stern teacher of humility, and perhaps that is why the shelters feel so human when we look closely. They are not monuments, they do not boast, they rarely remain, they sag, smoke, leak, and vanish. They show us survival not as a grand performance, but as maintenance performed while tired. A little wall against wind, a little roof against snow, a little bed against frozen ground, a little fire against the endless dark. By the time the man lies down again, the camp has changed by inches. The log has settled nearer the coals. The smoke has found a new seam in the branches. The animals have quieted. The snow beyond the shelter has softened every track made before sunset. He pulls the robe close, keeps one ear open for the fire, and lets his eyes close not because the world is safe, but because for the moment it is arranged well enough. By morning, the shelter had done its quiet work if it had kept the man from becoming too cold to think. That was the real measure, not comfort, not pride, not whether the camp would impress anyone later. If he could rise, move his fingers, find his tools, tend the animals, eat something, and step back into the day with judgment still intact, then the low wall of branches had earned its place in history, even if no one ever wrote it down. Winter survival was rarely decided by one spectacular moment. It was decided by whether a person could keep making ordinary decisions after a bad night. The first light in such a camp would not arrive warmly. It would come grey and thin, touching the snow before it touched the body. The fire might be no more than a buried pulse beneath ash. The shelter roof might have sagged under its small load of snow, and where smoke had gathered, the boughs would be darkened, wet at the tips, smelling of pitch and old coals. A man waking there might lie still for a few breaths, not from laziness, but because the body knew what was waiting outside the robe. Movement meant cold air under the blanket. Movement meant stiff joints. Movement meant discovering which things had frozen in the night. Then the little inventory began. Feet first, because feet could ruin everything. Were the moccasins still flexible? Had the inner wrappings dried at all, or only steamed themselves into a new dampness? Had one boot slumped too close to the fire and hardened strangely along one edge? Was there snow inside? Was there blood from a rubbed heel, or only the usual ache? This was not delicate concern, it was practical. A man might tolerate sore hands, a smoky throat, and a sour mood, but bad feet could shorten the day, slow the trapline, endanger the animals, and make the next shelter worse because he would arrive later and more tired. Cold made the body a ledger. Every small neglect entered its account. After the feet came the hands, the fire, the weapons, the powder, the food, the animals, the traps, the sky. In a settled house, morning can be a gentle returning to the world. In a winter camp, morning was inspection. The shelter had to release the man back into motion, and anything that failed during the night now demanded payment. A damp blanket was heavier, a frozen strap took time, a buried axe could delay departure, a lost coal meant rebuilding fire from scratch, unless some other method was at hand, and dry enough to answer. Keeping fire alive from night into morning was one of those small arts that did not look heroic until it failed. Coals could be banked under ash to preserve them. Larger logs could be arranged to burn slowly. A man who expected deep cold might prepare fuel before lying down, because searching for wood in the dark or before dawn invited misery. But exhaustion was persuasive. Many poor mornings must have begun with the bitter knowledge that last night's tired man had left too little for today's cold one. If the fire could be coaxed back. The camp changed almost immediately, not into comfort, but into possibility. A few twigs caught, smoke thickened, a flame licked along a split edge. The kettle could be set near the heat. Snow could begin its slow collapse into water. A piece of meat, if there was meat, could warm. Fingers could hover close enough to ache. The man might turn a stiff moccasin in his hands, or soften a frozen lace, or hold a tool where the heat could loosen its grip of ice. There is an intimacy to these morning repairs that grand history often misses. The great forces were there, of course. Fur markets, imperial boundaries, trading companies, native diplomacy, migration, violence, debt, ambition, hunger, and the long reach of commerce. But inside the shelter, history also looked like a man rubbing warmth into a strap so it would bend. A winter camp was always tied to labour waiting outside it. The shelter did not end the day's work, it only made the next day possible. If the man was trapping, he had lines to check. If he was travelling, he had miles to cover before weather closed. If he was wintering in a more fixed camp, there might be wood to cut, meat to secure, clothing to repair, animals to tend, and social tensions to manage inside cramped quarters. Shelter did not remove obligation. It simply gave obligation a place to sleep, and sometimes the best shelter was abandoned almost as soon as it had proved itself. This feels strange to a modern mind trained to value permanence. We see a structure and think of ownership, improvement, return. But many winter shelters in mobile life were not possessions in that way. a lean-to of brush, a bed of boughs, a snow-banked windbreak, a night's arrangement under a rock overhang. These could be left behind without ceremony. By afternoon, wind might erase tracks around them. By the next storm, the roof might collapse. By spring, the boughs might brown, settle, and become only a slight disturbance on the ground. The shelter had been important for one night and almost meaningless afterward. That is not failure. That is exactly what it was for. There is something deeply human in that kind of making. A person shapes the world just enough to pass through it, not to conquer it, not to own it forever, just enough to live until morning. Still, some camps became more than one-night answers. In wintering places, especially where groups stayed for weeks or months, shelters grew more deliberate. Men might improve a cabin, add chinking, stack more wood, hang hides, deepen a hearth, or make a better sleeping platform. Repetition changed the relationship with place. A draft that could be endured for one night became intolerable after 10. A leaky roof that was funny once became a daily insult. A doorway placed badly against the wind became a lesson repeated every time someone entered cursing. Longer winter shelter had its own social weather. A cramped cabin or lodge could preserve life and fray patience at the same time. Men brought in their habits, smells, tempers, jokes, debts, illnesses, and opinions. Someone snored, someone wasted fuel, someone took the warm spot too often. Someone told the same story until the story itself should have been sent outside to freeze. In a place where stepping away meant entering deep cold, privacy shrank to whatever space a person could find behind his own silence. Yet shared shelter also made tenderness possible, in plain, unsentimental forms. A man might wake another before the fire failed. Someone might share dry socks, lend a robe, pass a cup, patch a tear, or shift aside without comment so a colder companion could take warmth. Frontier writing often remembers boasting better than care, but care was there, hidden inside practical acts. In winter, kindness did not always sound like kindness. Sometimes it sounded like, "Move over, you fool, you're smoking us out," while someone fixed the fire anyway. The cold made people dependent, even when they preferred stories of independence. It made the proud accept help from the experienced. It made newcomers learn quickly or suffer loudly. It made knowledge valuable in forms too humble for legend. How to stack wood so it would not vanish under snow. How to hang a wet blanket without burning it. How to place bedding where the ground was less cruel. How to wake before the coals died. How to read a sky that promised the next shelter would need to be better. As the morning brightened, the man might step out from under the low roof and look back, only briefly. The shelter would appear smaller in daylight, almost embarrassing. A few poles, a heap of boughs, a smoky hollow where someone had passed the night. The fire log, blackened and split, would lie at the mouth of it like the last sentence of a conversation. Around it, the snow would be trampled, melted, stained with ash, pressed by knees, boots, hooves, and the small, restless motions of survival. Then the day would pull him away, and behind him, the shelter would begin to lose its shape, returning, piece by piece, to weather, timber, and silence. The shelters that lasted longer than a night began to collect habits. A man might first notice it in the path beaten between the doorway and the woodpile. At the beginning, there was only snow, then a few careful steps, then a trough where boots, moccasins, and hooves had pressed the same line again and again until the camp itself seemed to admit, "Yes, we are staying here a while." The shelter might still be crude, it might still smoke, leak, and insult everyone inside. But repetition gave it a small authority. The body began to know where things were kept. The hand reached for the kettle before the eyes found it. The axe leaned in its usual place. The best sleeping spot became known, disputed, and silently defended. In longer winter camps, shelter turned into routine, and routine was its own kind of war. The same fire tended before dawn, the same cracks stuffed after every hard wind, The same damp blankets shifted and dried. The same pile of cut wood watched with private worry, because wood disappeared faster when people were cold. A shelter was not built once, it was consumed day by day, repaired night by night, and fed constantly from the surrounding timber. The walls might stand still, but the whole camp was always moving through fuel. That is easy to forget when looking at a cabin. Logs seem solid, a roof seems like an answer. But the true winter structure included all the work outside it, the chopping, hauling, splitting, stacking, and protecting of wood from snow. Fire was the invisible room added to every shelter. Without it, a cabin became only a box in cold country. Better than open air, yes, but still only a pause before the body began to lose its heat. With fire, even a rough shelter could become livable, though never effortless. Woodcutting in winter had its own tired music. The axe bite, the dull fall of a limb into snow, the breath of the cutter, the pause while he straightened his back and listened to the woods. Dry fuel mattered, and finding it could be a daily concern. Standing dead timber, fallen branches protected from wet, resinous pieces that caught well, larger logs for the long hours, each type had a place in the camp's small economy. A man learned not just to burn wood, but to schedule it. Quick flame for cooking, steadier pieces for warmth, a slow log for the deep part of night, when getting up felt like a negotiation with the soul. Inside a longer shelter, the fire changed the walls. Smoke blackened the roof. Sparks marked blankets and hides with tiny histories of near trouble. Heat opened gaps in frozen mud chinking, then cold tightened them again. The hearth area became the centre of the room, but also the dirtiest, most contested, most necessary place. Everyone wanted to be near it. No one wanted to breathe too much of it. The smoke hole, or chimney, if there was one, was praised when it worked and cursed when it did not, which in rough shelters was often enough to keep language lively. A properly built chimney was not always available in a temporary or improvised camp. Some rough cabins used a mud and stick chimney, stone where stone could be found and arranged, or a simple smoke opening that did its best with the wind. These could work, partly work, or fail in changing weather. Smoke has no respect for optimism. It follows pressure, draft, damp fuel, roof shape, and wind direction. A man could improve a shelter all week and still wake one night with smoke calling low enough to make the room miserable. Yet the fire was also the clock. It marked the passing of hours by how often it needed feeding. It divided labour by who rose to tend it. It gave people a reason to stay awake when talk was wanted, and a reason to sleep when the coals were deep and steady. Around it, men repaired traps, sharpened tools, scraped hides, sewed torn seams, cleaned weapons, warmed food, and listened to stories. The fire made shelter social. It turned walls into a gathering place, even when the gathering was only two exhausted men saying almost nothing. There is a kind of history in almost nothing. The long silence after work, the nod toward a cup, the shifting of one knee so another person can reach the heat, a remark about the wind, a complaint about wood, a short laugh when someone discovers that the smoke has chosen him personally. These small pieces of life rarely survive in records, but they mattered. Shelter was not only a defence against weather, it was where men remained human enough to joke, mend, argue, remember, and dread the morning in company. In fixed camps, storage became part of architecture. Food had to be kept away from damp, spoilage, and animals. Powder needed dryness. Extra clothing, hides, robes, and trade goods had to be placed where they could be found, and where they would not be ruined by smoke, sparks, or meltwater. A cramped cabin could fill quickly. Every object had a smell and a problem. Meat attracted attention. Wet hides carried weight into the air. Blankets held smoke. Tools hid under bedding. A careless foot could knock over a cup, kick ashes, or step on something sharp enough to ruin the day. Order did not mean neatness in the modern sense. It meant memory. This pile is safe enough. That corner stays drier. The roof drips there when the thaw comes. Do not leave the powder near that wall. Put the green wood away from the good dry pieces. Hang the wet things where they will warm, but not burn. Such rules might never be spoken in grand language. They were simply learned into the hands. Where shelters stood near trading posts or wintering grounds, the social picture became wider still. Mountain men did not exist in empty wilderness outside all systems. Their camps were tied to rendezvous cycles, supply routes, native villages, company forts, family relationships, credit, debt, and the changing fur economy. A winter shelter might seem remote, but the goods inside could reveal distant connections. Wool blankets from trade, metal tools from industrial production, beads, kettles, guns, powder, cloth, traps, tobacco, coffee, and other things that made life in cold country possible, or at least more bearable. That makes the shelter less lonely, and in some ways more fragile. If supply failed, comfort failed, if trade relationships broke down, materials changed, if animals were lost, transport changed, if violence or disease affected a region, wintering decisions changed. A man's shelter was built from logs and boughs, yes, but also from trust, access, diplomacy, and timing. The cold entered through cracks in walls. It also entered through cracks in the wider world that kept a camp supplied. Still, inside the shelter, the experience remained bodily. A man could understand global commerce in the abstract, but at midnight he understood the blanket on his shoulders. He understood whether the roof dripped. He understood whether his stomach had enough warmth in it to let him sleep. He understood that a small cup of hot liquid could feel larger than politics. Sleep history should be honest about the big systems, but it should not forget the hand held near the fire. If the shelter was shared with families, the story changed again. Native women, Métis families, and mixed fur trade households were part of Western life in ways old adventure stories often pushed aside. Women's labour in making, maintaining, sewing, preparing food, processing hides, managing domestic space, and sustaining social ties could be central to survival, though it was not always celebrated in the loud masculine legends. A winter shelter could be a workplace of care as much as a bachelor camp of smoke and traps. Children, too, might know the cold not as romance, but as the ordinary edge of daily life. This broader view does not make the shelter less vivid. It makes it more real. The wall of branches, the hide door, the cabin hearth, the bough bed, all of them belonged not only to solitary men, but to networks of labour and knowledge. The mountain winter was not survived by rugged posture. It was survived by people doing necessary things, again and again, often without applause. Outside, the woodpile sinks lower. Inside, the roof holds its smoke-dark colour. Someone adds another piece to the fire. The flame takes it slowly, feeling along the bark before it opens bright. A kettle lid trembles. A wet mitten hangs where it might dry by morning. In the dimness, the shelter seems almost still, but everything inside it is being preserved by work, warmth, tools, tempers, food, stories, and the quiet hope that tomorrow's wind will come from the same direction as tonight's wall. By the time a winter camp had been lived in for several days, the shelter began to show the difference between a place made by design and a place made by weather arguing with human need. The roof might bow where snow had pressed it. The doorway might be lower than anyone remembered building it, because boughs had sagged and hides had stiffened, and the ground outside had risen under new layers of white. The smoke-darkened poles overhead could glisten faintly where frost gathered in the night and melted when the fire recovered. Along the bottom of the walls, snow might be banked like a second foundation, useful in 1 hour and troublesome in the next. If the fire warmed it too much, it softened, shrank, and sent thin, wet lines toward the sleeping places. If the cold returned sharply, those wet lines became hard ridges that waited for knees, elbows, and unlucky hands. A man living there learned the shelter's moods almost as if it were another person in camp. He knew which corner stayed damp, He knew where the smoke gathered when the wind came from the north. He knew which wall complained first in a storm, and which gap could be ignored until morning. A new arrival might see only a rough hut, a low lodge, or a mean little cabin with too much smoke in it. The men who had slept there knew its private map. That knowledge was not decorative, it saved time, and in winter, saved time was sometimes saved warmth. The more permanent the shelter became, the more it demanded a kind of housekeeping that frontier legends rarely admire. Ash had to be cleared or managed. Bedding had to be shaken, dried, turned, replaced. Meltwater had to be noticed before it reached powder, food, or blankets. Food scraps could not be left anywhere they might draw animals too close. Snow had to be pushed away from entrances. Wood had to be brought in before dark, not after everyone had become tired and the night had made the forest seem twice as large. This kind of work does not look like adventure from a distance. It looks like chores. But chores were part of survival's hidden skeleton. The glamorous moment might be crossing a pass or following a trap line under hard frost. The life-preserving moment might be much smaller, noticing that a roof pole is bending too far, or moving a drying moccasin before a spark ruins it, or adding one more armload to the woodpile because the sky has gone strangely flat. Snow was one of the great teachers of these details. It could be an enemy when it buried trails, soaked clothing, hid holes, or made fuel difficult to find. It could be an ally when banked against a wall, packed around a drafty base, or used to reflect a little light around a dark camp. It could make a shelter quieter, softening the outside world until the only sounds left were the fire, the breath of animals, and the occasional low thump of snow sliding from branches. But snow never stayed one thing. It changed with temperature, wind, age, and weight. Fresh powder behaved differently from crust. Wet snow behaved differently from dry. Old drifted snow could be carved, leaned against, or feared depending on where it lay. A man might use a snowbank as part of a windbreak, cutting into its lee side, or tucking camp where the wind had already spent some of its force. He might pile snow against brush to seal low drafts. He might scrape down to earth for a fire area, or tamp the ground around a sleeping place, or use snow to hold down the edge of a hide or blanket. None of this made snow tame. It only made it briefly useful. The next gust could undo the arrangement. The next thaw could wet it. The next freeze could turn it into something harder and less forgiving. And there was always the question of fire near snow, a problem almost comic in its stubbornness. The fire that kept a man alive could make the shelter wet. The snow that blocked the wind could melt toward the bed. The warmth everyone wanted could loosen the very wall that helped preserve it. So the camp became a place of small corrections. Scrape here, bank there. Move the bedding a hand's width higher. Lay a pole to keep a robe off the wet patch. Feed the fire less fiercely for a while, then shiver and feed it more. In timber country, bark could be useful too, though not always available in the neat sheets imagination prefers. Where it could be stripped or found from fallen trees, bark might help shed weather or cover a roof. It could be layered with poles and boughs. It could close gaps, line a storage place, or make a rough surface less exposed to snow. But bark also cracked, curled, held dampness, and behaved badly when hurried. Like every other material, it required patience. The wilderness did not hand out finished building supplies. It offered substances with opinions. Hides and skins had their own temper. A hide used as a door, cover, or windbreak could stiffen in cold, sag when damp, smoke when too near the fire, and smell strongly when old weather and animal grease worked their way through it. Yet hides could also make the difference between a drafty hollow and a space that held warmth. A robe hung near an entrance could soften the wind. A skin over a frame could make a lodge or shelter more weather-resistant. A piece of hide stretched low might preserve heat near sleeping bodies. It was not perfect. It was precious, because nothing was perfect. Canvas, where available, could be useful in similar ways, though it belonged more clearly to trade, military, expedition, and transport worlds than to the fantasy of pure wilderness. Cloth could be pitched, wrapped, folded, tied, or used as a quick roof. It was lighter than many hides, but vulnerable to sparks, dampness, strain, and hard wind. A canvas cover in snow country could feel like civilization reduced to one thin sheet. When it held, it was a blessing. When it snapped, leaked, or smoked, it became another reminder that a wall need not be thick to cause trouble. The materials shaped the people inside. A low brush shelter made men bend. A tight cabin made them share air. A skin cover made every spark a small threat. A snow-banked wall made them think about melting. A rough chimney made them watch smoke. The shelter trained posture, movement, temper, and sleep. It told a man where to sit, where not to put his feet, where to hang damp things, and how quietly he could turn over without waking someone already annoyed by the cold. This is where winter shelter becomes more than a structure. It becomes a teacher of humility through inconvenience. No part of the camp is allowed to remain abstract. Cold becomes a sleeve that will not dry. Wind becomes a gap under the wall. Fuel becomes a shrinking pile. Hunger becomes a shorter temper. Fatigue becomes a roof left unrepaired. Shelter turns the big idea of survival into 100 small negotiations, most of them too ordinary to become legends and too important to ignore. A man may have carried in his mind certain ideals of independence, bravery, and frontier freedom, but by the 7th cold morning, the shelter would have taught him a quieter vocabulary. Dry. Enough. Close. Higher. Move that. Save this. Not there. Wait. Listen. These words do not fill heroic biographies. They fill winter. Outside the doorway, the day might be bright enough now to make the snow painful to look at. The mountains would stand beyond the timber, indifferent and beautiful in the clean distance. Inside, the shelter would smell of smoke, damp boughs, old wool, leather, and the faint sourness of people living too near the same fire. A kettle would warm, someone would cough, someone would tug at a frozen knot and mutter without much hope of being answered kindly. And still, for all its flaws, the shelter would be doing what it was made to do, holding a little heat, holding tools, holding bodies, holding the night's damage back just far enough that the day could begin again. The longer a shelter stood, the more it revealed the truth that cold was not only outside. Cold lived in objects. It lived in the iron of a trap, in the edge of a knife, in the frozen mouth of a canteen or kettle, in a wet seam, in a stiffened strap, in the floor where a blanket had grown thin. It lived in the pause before a man put on footwear that had hardened overnight. It lived in the small dread of touching metal with bare fingers. It lived in a piece of clothing that looked dry by firelight, but still held enough dampness to steal warmth once the body relaxed. A shelter had to manage all of that, not just air temperature, not just snow, not just wind. It had to be a place where the materials of life could be brought back from the edge of uselessness, dry enough to wear, warm enough to bend, soft enough to tie, safe enough to store. In the coldest winters, keeping objects alive was part of keeping people alive. This is why the inside of a mountain shelter could seem crowded even with only 1 or 2 people in it. Everything needed a place, near warmth, but not too near. Moccasins wanted drying, but leather disliked being cooked. Blankets wanted smoke and heat to chase dampness out, but sparks could ruin them. Powder needed protection, but not in a spot where meltwater would creep along the ground. Meat needed warming or preserving, but food smells invited attention. A gun needed to stay serviceable, but sudden warmth could bring condensation where a careful man did not want it. The room, if it deserved that generous word, became a map of risks. Near the fire, the warmest place was never simply comfortable. It was busy. A person sitting there might be drying socks, turning a strip of hide, heating a little water, nursing coals, watching a kettle, and trying not to breathe the smoke that had decided, once again, to behave like a living creature with a grudge. Behind him, someone else might want the same space. Above him, the roof might drip. Below him, the ground might be thawing into mud. The best place in the shelter was often only the place where the most problems gathered at once. The doorway was another problem with a personality. Too open, and the wind came in low, sliding across the floor and under robes as if invited. Too closed, and smoke stayed. A hide, blanket, brush screen, or rough plank arrangement could soften the entrance, but no door was neutral. It changed the draft. It changed the fire. It changed how quickly someone could get out to tend animals, fetch wood, or answer some sound in the dark. A good doorway in winter was not merely an opening. It was a negotiation between breathing, warmth, smoke, and urgency. In some shelters, especially those shaped by poles and skins or cloth, the whole structure depended on tension. Lines had to hold. Stakes had to stay in ground that might be frozen hard or hidden beneath snow. Edges had to be weighted with logs, stones, snow, or whatever could keep the wind from lifting them. When a gust struck, the shelter might shift and snap softly, every rope or thong making its own complaint. A man half asleep could hear whether a sound was ordinary or whether the night was beginning to take the roof apart. That kind of listening was a skill, but not one easily written into grand history. The old records may tell us where men travelled, what they trapped, who they traded with, what storms they endured, or when a party nearly starved. They do not always tell us the little sound of a shelter loosening at 2 a.m, yet those sounds shaped behaviour. A man learned when to ignore a flap of cloth, and when to rise before the wind made a larger decision for him. He learned which creeks belonged to settling poles, and which suggested too much snow weight. He learned that laziness could be forgiven on a warm afternoon, but not always in a winter shelter after midnight. The body listened too. Sleep in such a place was rarely the smooth, long sleep we imagine when we say someone bedded down. It was broken and practical. A man might wake to cold feet, feed the fire, sleep again, wake to smoke, shift the robe, sleep again, wake because another person moved, wake because an animal stamped, wake because the wind fell silent in a way that suggested new snow. These awakenings were not interruptions of the shelter's work. They were part of it. The shelter relied on the sleeper not sleeping too deeply. This is one of the hidden differences between modern comfort and historical survival. Today, a good room lets us forget the weather. Then, a good shelter often allowed a person to remember it in time. You did not want to be fully exposed, but you also did not want to become so unaware that the fire died, the roof loaded, the horse tangled, or the wind shifted smoke dangerously low. Rest was real, but it carried a thread of watchfulness through it. That thread ran through the whole winter camp. Before lying down, someone might check the firewood once more, not because he wished to be industrious, but because the hours before dawn had a way of making earlier confidence look silly. A stack that seemed generous at sunset might look pitiful at 3 a.m. The long, cold middle of the night used fuel without apology. It consumed the cheerful pieces first, then demanded the awkward ones. Men who knew winter learned to save wood that would hold coals, to arrange logs so they did not burn too fast, and to wake before the fire became only memory. And yet, fuel was not endless. In a long camp, nearby deadwood could be used up, forcing men farther from shelter for each load. Deep snow made hauling harder. A storm could cover what had been gathered. If animals needed attention, if traps needed checking, if food was scarce, woodcutting competed with every other demand. The shelter's warmth depended on a labour line stretching out into the trees. Every glowing coal had a history of swings, steps, breath, and cold hands. Sometimes the forest around a winter camp must have looked strangely marked by human need. Stumps under snow, broken branches, drag trails where logs had been pulled, chips scattered and then buried, a pile of cut wood standing like a small promise beside the shelter wall. The camp was not simply placed in the wilderness. It slowly edited the ground around it. It took fuel, bedding, poles, brush, and space. It made a clearing of use. In the softer telling of mountain life, nature is scenery. In the colder telling, nature is also inventory. Not in the careless sense of ownership, but in the immediate sense of what can be used before darkness. A fallen trunk is not picturesque if it is the only dry wood. A stand of spruce is not merely beautiful if its lower branches will become tonight's bedding. A snowdrift is not just white if it can block wind or bury the trail. The winter traveller saw landscape through need, and need sharpened the eye. Still, need did not erase beauty. It may have made beauty more sudden. A man stepping out from a smoky shelter before dawn might see the world in a clarity that almost mocked his discomfort. Stars hard and bright above black trees, snow faintly blue before sunrise, breath drifting from animals in slow, pale clouds. The shelter behind him smelling of ash and damp robes, his hands aching, his shoulders stiff, and beyond all that, a silence so large it seemed to have weight. He might stand there only a moment, because cold discouraged long appreciation. But the moment belonged to him anyway. Then he would turn back to the little human arrangement at his feet. The fire to wake, the wood to ration, the frozen strap to soften, the bed to shake out, the roof to nudge free of snow. The mountains could be immense. Survival was often small enough to hold in one hand. Inside, as the coals stirred and the first thin flame returned, the shelter began again. Not new, never new, but briefly renewed. Smoke lifted into its familiar dark path. A kettle shifted. Someone pulled a robe closer and asked without opening his eyes whether there was enough wood. The answer, as usual, depended on how kindly one wished to define enough. The answer, more often than not, was no. Enough was a word that kept moving. At sunset, enough wood meant the pile looked respectable beside the shelter wall. At midnight, it meant the fire still had a heart. Before dawn, it meant someone could reach from the robe, drag a piece inward, and not have to step barefoot or half-dressed into the bitter air. By full morning, enough meant there was still fuel to melt snow, warm food, soften frozen gear, and make the shelter feel like a place of return, rather than a place barely escaped. This moving meaning of enough shapes the whole cold-weather life of mountain men. It shaped where they camped. It shaped how far they ranged from camp. It shaped whether they spent their last useful daylight on a better roof, a larger woodpile, or checking the animals before the storm settled in. People who imagine winter survival as a series of clever tricks miss the slower pressure. It was arithmetic done with tired bodies. How much daylight remains? How much strength remains? How much dry fuel remains? How much cold is coming? And the cruel part was that no one could measure the night perfectly. A sky that looked manageable could deepen into trouble. Wind could rise after dark. Snow could arrive without drama and build weight hour by hour. A mild spell could melt the shelter's careful edges, then freeze everything into awkward shapes by morning. The mountain weather did not need to be theatrical to be dangerous. It only needed to be changeable. A shelter that worked well for one kind of night might become poor for another. This uncertainty gave winter shelter its restless quality. Even when men stayed in one camp, the place was never completely settled. A wall might need reinforcement after a storm. A roof might need brushing clear. A fire area might need to be moved slightly because meltwater had found it. The sleeping place might need more boughs after the old ones flattened. Someone might decide that a draft long tolerated had finally become an enemy worth fighting. In this way, winter shelter was not a noun so much as a verb. It was something people kept doing. That work could become strangely intimate. A man remembered the angle of a pole because his shoulder had struck it 3 times in the dark. He knew the feel of the doorway hide when it had frozen along the bottom edge. He knew how the smoke smelled when the wood was too green. He knew the difference between snow falling on the roof and snow sliding from the trees above it. He knew the camp by its inconveniences, and inconvenience is one of the oldest forms of memory. The shelter also shaped time. Inside it, the day did not simply begin at sunrise and end at sunset. It was divided by fire maintenance, wood gathering, cooking, drying, repairing, and the constant small checks that cold required. The long hours after dark were not empty. They held chores too quiet to call chores, turning a damp moccasin, nudging ash over coals, rubbing feeling back into fingers, shifting gear away from a drip, listening for animals. Judging whether that noise outside was only wind, for trappers working winter streams, this rhythm could be especially harsh because the day's labour pulled them repeatedly into wet places. Beaver country meant ice edges, soaked brush, cold mud, willow tangles, and water that seemed to wait for the smallest mistake. A man could spend the day trying not to become wet and still return to camp carrying dampness in every fold and seam. Then the shelter had to perform one of its hardest tasks, not merely keeping out the weather, but undoing what the work had done. Drying was slow, and hurry could ruin things. Leather dried too fast near flame might stiffen or crack. Cloth too close to sparks might catch or char. Fur and hides could singe. A wet wool garment might steam cheerfully while remaining damp in its deeper layers. The firelight could lie. Something warm to the touch might still be cold at its heart. A man learned to mistrust appearances, because winter punished optimism dressed as certainty. This careful drying turned the interior of a shelter into a kind of workshop of patience. Items hung from poles, leaned against logs, lay across packs, or rested where warmth passed but flame could not easily reach. A mitten might hang like a tired animal above the fire. A strip of hide might be turned again and again. A blanket might be lifted, shaken, and shifted through the evening. The shelter smelled not only of smoke, but of the slow argument between dampness and heat. Food added another rhythm. Meat, when available, could be roasted, boiled, dried, or warmed. Fat mattered deeply in cold weather because it carried energy the body could feel. A lean meal might fill the mouth but leave the body asking for more. A richer one could make the shelter seem warmer from the inside out. The old winter appetite was not delicate. It was practical and repetitive, driven by work, cold, and the body's need to keep producing heat. A kettle or pot, simple as it seems, could become one of the most important objects in camp. It made snow into water. It turned meat into broth. It softened hard food. It provided warmth that could be held between hands for a few moments before being swallowed. In a rough shelter, the sound of a kettle beginning to stir near the fire could change the mood more than any speech. It promised that the night had not reduced everything to endurance. There would be something warm, perhaps thin, perhaps smoky, perhaps not enough, but warm. And in winter, warmth did not need to be poetic. It was persuasive, all by itself. The shelter's emotional life gathered around these small promises. Warm food, dry socks, a coal preserved, a windbreak holding, a companion waking when the fire was low, a horse still standing quietly beyond the glow, a roof that sagged but did not fail. Each small success made the night less absolute. Not easy, not comfortable in the modern sense, but survivable in pieces. This pieced-together survival is important because it resists the clean myth of the mountain man as a figure outside dependence. The cold made dependence visible. Dependence on fire, on wood, on animals, on trade goods, on native knowledge and local experience, on companions, if there were any, on tools, on luck, on the fact that a storm waited until after a man had built something rather than before. The shelter was where all these dependencies gathered under one low roof. There may have been pride in such life. There was certainly skill. There was also discomfort, debt, improvisation, borrowing, and repeated correction. A man could know a country well and still be humbled by a new storm. He could have slept in dozens of winter camps and still build a poor shelter on a bad evening because he was tired, rushed, hungry, or fooled by the wind. Experience did not remove vulnerability. It only gave vulnerability better manners. Sometimes the shelter's greatest service was psychological. It gave the mind a boundary. Outside was storm, darkness, animals, distance, and work not yet done. Inside was smoke, trouble, and cramped misery, yes, but also a circle where tasks could be named. dry this, warm that, eat, sleep, wake, mend. The walls, however rough, reduced the world to a size a tired person could manage. That reduction mattered. A human being cannot fight an entire winter at once. He can only repair a gap, bank a coal, cut another armload, pull the robe tighter, listen, and rest. The mountain shelter made winter small enough to meet hour by hour. Beyond the doorway, snow might still fall with no interest in human effort. Inside, a man might sit with his back curved under the low roof, hands wrapped around a cup gone warm at the rim, smoke dimming the light above him. The fire log at the shelter mouth would be half gone now, its outer bark black and its heart red. He would watch it settle, not with romance, but with the practical fondness one gives to something doing its job. For a little while, enough had returned. That return of enough was never permanent. It came in small arrivals, stayed a while, and left as soon as the weather, the woodpile, or the body changed. A man might feel it after warm food, when his hands had stopped aching and the shelter seemed almost clever. Then he would step outside to gather more fuel, and the air would take the feeling from him in a single breath. He might feel it after banking snow against the wall, then hear the wind shift and discover that the door now smoked worse than before. He might feel it under a robe beside a steady fire, then wake to find the coals low, the roof dripping, and one foot gone cold because it had slipped off the bough bed. Winter never allowed success to sit still for long. That is why the best shelter builders were not necessarily the men who made the prettiest structures. They were the ones who noticed quickly, corrected calmly, and did not fall in love with their first solution. A beautiful lean-to facing the wrong way was a handsome mistake. A crude brush wall in the right place could be a friend. A rough cabin badly ventilated could punish everyone inside. A shallow hollow under a bank, improved with branches and a careful fire, could make one night survivable, when a more ambitious plan would have failed from lack of daylight. Practical intelligence in cold weather often looked unimpressive. It looked like choosing not to build where the view was grand, because the wind had too clear a run. It looked like settling for a smaller fire, because the roof was low and smoke was already becoming troublesome. It looked like moving camp a little farther into the timber, even though the snow was deeper there. It looked like putting effort into the bed before improving the wall, because frozen ground was stealing more warmth than the air. It looked like accepting that the shelter you wanted was not the shelter the evening allowed. There is a lesson there that feels almost too plain until you sit with it. A mountain winter did not reward fantasy. It rewarded attention to limits. The limits were everywhere. Tools had limits. A dull axe changed the possible shape of camp. A broken handle could make a good plan vanish. A knife could split small pieces, cut thongs, trim bark, or repair gear, but it could not replace every lost tool. Rope, rawhide, leather straps, sinew, and cordage all mattered, because shelters often depended on tying, hanging, stretching, or securing materials. In deep cold, even tying could become a trial. Fingers thick in mittens could not perform fine work. Bare fingers could work better and suffer faster. A knot that had frozen hard might seem designed by a personal enemy. Materials had limits too. Green boughs could cover a roof, but might not shed weather perfectly. Bark could help, but it might split or curl. Hides blocked wind but stiffened and smoked. Blankets softened cold but absorbed dampness. Snow sealed drafts but melted near fire. Logs made walls but required time, tools, and strength. No material was simply good. Each had a temperament, and the shelter was the art of placing one troublesome thing against another, until the night became less troublesome than before. The human body had the most important limits, and the least patience for being ignored. Cold made a man slower before it made him helpless. It narrowed thought. It made tasks seem larger. It made irritation easier and humour more necessary. A tired man might postpone one repair, not because he did not know better, but because he could not bear one more movement away from warmth. That postponed repair might mean a smoky hour later, or a wet blanket in the morning. or a gap that let wind work all night against his back. This is where the old heroic image becomes unfair. It imagines survival as a clean contest of courage. In truth, many failures probably came from ordinary exhaustion, from arriving too late, from being hungry, from having wet feet, from making a small bad choice after a long day of mostly good ones, from thinking a little wood would be enough because cutting more felt unbearable. The cold did not need a man to be foolish, it only needed him to be tired. Yet tired people still built. That is the marvel of these shelters. Not that they were perfect, but that they were made at all, again and again, by people who had often already spent the day in hard labour. A man might have checked traps in freezing water, climbed out of creek bottoms, handled stiff metal, led animals through snow, carried gear, searched for food, and returned to camp with daylight leaking out of the sky. Then came the building, or the repairing, or the improvement that could not be delayed. Survival waited at the end of work, not instead of it. When several people shared that labour, the shelter could improve quickly. One cut poles, another gathered boughs, another cleared snow, someone arranged bedding, someone coaxed fire, someone watched animals. The work divided naturally when people knew what needed doing, but groups also required coordination, patience, and a willingness to accept the flaws of other people's methods. A camp could be saved by companionship and irritated by it in equal measure. The shelter became a record of decisions no one might remember clearly later. Why was that wall doubled? Because the wind came through there 3 nights ago. Why was the fire set a little off-centre? Because the smoke hole drew better that way. Why was the bedding raised on poles? Because meltwater ran under it during the last thaw. Why was the doorway lower than convenient? Because the higher opening let too much air in. Every awkward feature had a reason. Some were wise. Some were merely old mistakes that had become part of the room. Long cold teaches people to stop asking whether things are ideal and start asking whether they work. That question can make a shelter ugly, but effective. A hide hung crookedly may block the worst draft. A log pushed into a gap may be clumsy to step around, but useful. A pile of brush may look like neglect and function like insulation. Snow banked unevenly along one side may preserve more warmth than a neat wall left bare. Winter had no aesthetic standard except consequence. At the same time, the shelter could shape imagination. After enough nights under low roofs and smoky covers, a person's idea of comfort became beautifully reduced. A dry sleeping place, a fire that did not need constant rescue, a doorway that could be closed without choking the room, a pair of foot wrappings that had actually dried, enough food to let sleep come easily, a roof that held through wind, a little space to sit without bending the neck too sharply. These were not luxuries in that world, they were riches. And perhaps that is part of why frontier memory could later exaggerate comfort. Once a man was safe, or older, or speaking to people who had never slept under a leaking bough roof in winter, the roughness could become a story. Smoke becomes atmosphere. Cold becomes toughness. Misery becomes colour. The mind edits hardship into meaning because raw discomfort is hard to carry forever. But the shelter itself, if we look at it honestly, brings us back to scale. It was not made of legend. It was made of branches, snow, hides, tools, labour, and the wish to stop shivering. Even the famous independence of the mountain man looks different from inside the shelter. Independence, there, did not mean needing nothing. It meant knowing how much one needed and how quickly need could turn. It meant carrying certain goods because the land did not provide everything. It meant borrowing knowledge because no one learned an entire continent alone. It meant depending on animals, companions, trade, memory, and weather behaving just well enough. The shelter was not proof that a man needed no one. It was proof that he knew how much could go wrong. As evening came again, the shelter's floors would reappear in the changing light. The low roof, the darkened poles, the bedding needing renewal, the woodpile not quite as large as anyone wished, the entrance stiff with frost along its edge. But now those floors were familiar, Familiar did not mean safe, exactly. It meant readable. A man could crouch at the opening and see the night arranging itself beyond the fire. He could hear the timber settling, the animals shifting, the first small movement of wind through branches. He could reach for another log before the cold demanded it. He could pull the robe nearer. He could look at the shelter, poor and smoky as it was, and understand what needed doing next. For that moment, understanding was its own warmth. The understanding, like the fire, had to be tended before it faded. A man who knew winter did not wait for misery to become obvious. He watched for the small warnings. Smoke dipping lower than usual. Snow beginning to drift against the entrance instead of lying flat. The animals turning their rumps to the wind. A roof pole taking on a slow bend. The fire burning too fast because air was being pulled through some new gap. A blanket growing heavier at the edge where meltwater had found it. These were not dramatic signs, but they mattered more than dramatic signs, because they arrived early enough to be useful. This kind of attention could make the difference between a shelter that merely existed and a shelter that worked through the night. It also created a kind of quiet fatigue that is easy to overlook. To be cold is one burden. To be responsible for noticing everything cold might do next is another. The winter shelter asked a man to sleep lightly, think ahead, remember what had failed before, and correct things before pride or exhaustion persuaded him to ignore them. In the old mountain trade, men learned such habits through experience, but experience was not gentle. A first winter could educate with humiliating speed. A man might discover that the handsome place he chose for camp collected cold air after sunset. He might learn that the wood he stacked near the shelter was too green to burn cleanly. He might find that the roof he praised at dusk funneled smoke into his face after the wind turned. He might wake to boots so frozen that putting them on became a small act of punishment. The lesson would not need a teacher's voice. It would be there, in his fingers, his throat, his feet, and the long ache of a badly slept night. Older hands, if they were inclined to speak, might not explain much. They might simply choose a different place, cut a different kind of wood, lay boughs more carefully, or bank snow in a way the newcomer did not understand until morning. Knowledge in such camps often moved through example before words. Watch where he puts the fire. Watch which side of the trees he trusts. Watch how he keeps damp gear away from the ground. Watch how he wakes before the coals have gone completely dark. The shelter became a school where failure was cold and success was sometimes only the absence of disaster. It is tempting to imagine these lessons as belonging only to European American mountain men, because those are the figures popular memory has loved to paint in buckskin. But the real world of shelter knowledge in the West was far more mixed, older, and more complicated. Indigenous peoples across North America had developed shelter forms suited to region, season, mobility, community, ceremony, and available materials long before the fur trade made certain men famous. Plains lodges, brush structures, bark-covered dwellings, earth lodges, wickiup-like shelters, snow uses, and many other local practices belong to distinct peoples and places, not to one single category. Mountain men entered that world as learners, orowers, traders, husbands, guests, rivals, employees, and sometimes intruders. Some adopted clothing, tools, travel methods, foods, and shelter habits through close contact with native communities and mixed families. Some misunderstood what they saw. Some depended on knowledge without preserving the names of those who carried it. A careful history has to admit both the skill of individual trappers and the deeper fact that survival in Western winter was never invented by solitary men out of sheer stubbornness. A skin lodge, for example, was not just a picturesque shape on the plains. Its form reflected materials, mobility, fire management, wind, social life, and long experience. A brush shelter in timber country could also be highly practical, without looking impressive to an outsider. A winter camp near a native community might be shaped by relationships and customs that a later adventure story would barely mention. Even the choice of where to camp could reflect generations of local observation. Which valley held wind? Which grove caught snow? Which water stayed accessible? Which slope thawed early? Which place became dangerous when weather changed? The mountain man's shelter, then, should not be imagined as a lonely invention standing outside history. It was part of a borderland of knowledge, commerce, adaptation, and sometimes conflict. A low roof of branches might carry lessons older than the man who slept under it. A hide doorway might owe its usefulness to the work of people who scraped, prepared, sewed, traded, or repaired that hide. A robe might have moved through social ties that mattered as much as any trail. The shelter was local, but its story was wide, and yet, for the person inside it, the experience could still become very small. This is one of the strange balances of history. We can speak of trade systems, indigenous knowledge, colonial expansion, environmental adaptation, and material culture. All of that is true and necessary. But the man in the shelter might only be thinking that the smoke is too thick and his left foot is cold. The body brings large history down to scale. It does this especially in winter, when abstract ideas lose patience. Freedom becomes whether you can move without pain in the morning. Wealth becomes whether there is meat, fat, dry powder, and fuel. Skill becomes whether the roof holds and the fire breathes. Trade becomes the blanket across your shoulders. Cultural exchange becomes the way you arrange poles because someone else once showed someone how the wind behaves. Memory becomes the rule you follow without remembering the first night that taught it. This body-scale history is not smaller than the grand version. It is often more honest. A person survives not in the whole West at once, but in one camp, under one roof, beside one fire, while one storm decides what kind of teacher it will be. In the coldest stretches, even speech might shrink. Men who had spent a day working in snow and water did not always have energy for long talk. They might sit close to the heat, faces partly hidden by smoke and shadow, each occupied with a repair or a thought. A needle passing through leather, a knife scraping a small strip of wood, a hand turning a moccasin, someone clearing his throat, someone asking whether the wind has eased. The answer might be no, or not yet, or only a grunt that meant the listener should stop hoping for miracles. But silence in a shelter was not emptiness. It was full of listening. Listening to the fire and the roof. Listening to weather. Listening to animals. Listening to another person's breathing to know whether he had finally fallen asleep. Listening to the tiny betrayals of materials. A tie loosening. A branch slipping. A drip beginning. In that smoky half-dark, the ear became part of the wall. Some nights, if the weather softened, the shelter could seem almost kind. The fire drew well, the wind passed over instead of through. Snow lay against the outside like a blanket rather than a threat. The bedding held its shape. The food warmed. A story might come out, not loudly, but enough to bring a little human warmth into the air. Someone might laugh at a previous night's disaster now that it had become survivable enough to be funny. A man might stretch his sore feet toward the coals and feel, for a few minutes, that winter had stepped back. Those moments mattered because they kept hardship from becoming the only truth. A shelter was not merely where people suffered the cold. It was also where they recovered enough to notice small comforts. The first sip from a warm cup, a robe dried better than expected, a mitten found after everyone thought it lost, the rich smell of fat hitting heat, the satisfaction of a wall that no longer leaked wind after 3 attempts and several unkind remarks. Comfort, in that world, was often patched together from relief, and relief has its own memory. Long after the camp was gone, a man might remember not the exact shape of the shelter, but the feeling when the fire finally caught in bad weather. The way a companion's blanket blocked a draught. The sound of snow sliding harmlessly off a roof he had doubted. The small pride of waking to coals still alive. Such memories could later become stories, and stories could smooth the rough edges. But beneath the telling, there remained the old fact. Shelter was the art of giving relief a place to happen. Outside, the wind moves again through the timber, testing the camp with patient fingers. Inside, someone notices before anyone speaks. Her hand reaches for the half-burned log and turns it toward the coals. The flame takes slowly, then brightens. The shelter answers in its own imperfect way, smoke lifting, boughs settling, shadows moving over tired faces, warmth returning by inches. Warmth returning by inches could make a shelter feel wiser than it really was. A few minutes of flame, a cup near the hands, a robe drawn close. And suddenly the rough work of the evening seemed to have been enough after all. The crooked poles looked intentional. The smoky roof looked seasoned. The draught at the doorway seemed manageable, almost familiar. A tired man could forgive a great deal once his fingers stopped hurting. But winter had a habit of making forgiveness temporary. It waited until the body relaxed, then pointed out the next flaw. Perhaps the smoke thickened when the fire began to burn better. Perhaps the snow at the edge of the entrance softened and let in a thread of water. Perhaps a horse tugged at its line and forced someone out into the dark. Perhaps the wind dropped so completely that the smoke no longer drew upward, but lingered under the roof in a low, bitter layer. The shelter's problems did not disappear when warmth returned. They only changed order. That shifting order mattered because the men who lived through these winters were rarely solving one problem at a time. Cold, smoke, wet, hunger, fatigue, tools, animals, and time all crowded into the same small space. Improve one, and another might worsen. Close the doorway, and the room warms, but smoke gathers. Open the doorway, and breathing improves, but the wind finds the bedding. Build a hotter fire, and gear dries, but sparks threaten robes, and the snow wall melts. Keep the fire low and safer, but the body begins to lose its argument with the night. A good shelter was therefore not the absence of trouble. It was a trouble arrangement that could be survived. This was especially true in severe cold, when the shelter had to protect not only comfort, but judgment. A man who became deeply chilled did not simply feel unpleasant. He became slower in the mind. Decisions took longer. Movements became clumsy. Annoyance could replace caution. The shelter's purpose was partly to keep the body warm enough that the person inside could remain the kind of person who made useful decisions. That is a humbler goal than romance gives us, but a far more important one. The coldest winters also revealed how much depended on timing. Building too late meant cutting poles by poor light, gathering fuel in haste, laying bedding without care, and discovering mistakes when repairing them was harder. Stopping earlier could feel wasteful if there were miles to cover or traps to check, but a little daylight spent on camp might return itself in warmth, sleep, and fewer morning failures. The experienced traveller understood that darkness added cost to every task. A branch easy to find at dusk could disappear under snow by night. A good campsite passed by in stubbornness might not be matched farther on. So, shelter began with humility toward the afternoon. That may sound odd, but the afternoon was when winter asked its first serious question. Are you wise enough to stop before you are forced to? A man pushing on too long might gain distance and lose the chance for a decent camp. He might reach water but find no dry fuel. He might find timber but be too exhausted to use it well. He might save an hour of travel and spend 3 hours fighting a poor sight in the dark. The mountains did not reward every kind of determination. Sometimes they rewarded stopping. In this way, the shelter was built partly from restraint. The decision not to chase 1 more mile, not to wait until the sky closed, not to assume that strength at noon would still be available after sunset, not to treat winter as if it were merely scenery around a human plan. Restraint is not as exciting as courage, but in cold country, it could be the older and rarer virtue. Once the place was chosen, the body moved through a sequence that repeated across countless camps in countless variations. Clear a space, find dry enough fuel, cut or drag what can be used, shape the windbreak or roof, lay bedding, protect gear, start or revive fire, arrange the open side toward heat and away from punishment if possible. Work faster as the light fades, but not so fast that sweat soaks the clothing. Each act sounds simple when spoken calmly. In the doing, each carried weight. There is a particular tiredness in building shelter after travel. The arms have already worked. The back has already carried. The legs have already stepped through snow, brush, mud, or slope. The hands may have handled wet lines, traps, reins, tools, or game. Then, just when the body wants to fold inward, it must become practical. It must lift, cut, tie, drag, bend, scrape, stack. Shelter building in winter was often performed by people who were already past the point where modern comfort would call the day complete. That is why small efficiencies mattered. Knowing how to lean poles quickly. Knowing which branches made better bedding. Knowing when a fallen tree could serve as one wall. Knowing how to place a fire so it warmed without filling the shelter entirely with smoke. Knowing that a rock face might reflect heat, or that a dense thicket might save half the labour of wind protection. Experience saved motion, and saved motion preserved warmth. The landscape sometimes offered ready-made beginnings. A fallen tree with its root mass lifted could create a wind shadow. A bank or cut slope could block one side. A rock overhang could serve as roof if dry and safe enough. A cluster of evergreens could catch snow above and break the wind below. A hollow beneath thick branches could feel almost like a room before any work began. These places were not gifts without conditions. They could drip, smoke, hide animals, shed snow, or trap cold air. But they gave a tired person somewhere to start. Starting mattered. The shelter that already had one good wall in the shape of a log or bank could be completed faster than one built in open ground. A campsite with standing dead wood nearby might mean warmer hours later. A place with boughs close at hand meant bedding before darkness. A small natural advantage, noticed early, could multiply through the whole night. That is another kind of skill, seeing not what the place is, but what it is almost ready to become. Sometimes, though, the place gave very little. Open country, scarce timber, high wind, deep snow, poor fuel, or urgent travel could reduce choices to something meaner. Then shelter might be a low windbreak of packs, saddles, robes, or whatever could be arranged. Men might huddle near a fire guarded by snow or stones. They might use animals, terrain, or gear to interrupt the wind. They might sleep badly and call that success because badly was still sleep. Not every winter night allowed good craft. Some allowed only endurance with a little organisation. The title of mountain man carries a heavy load of later imagination. It makes a person sound almost larger than weather, but many cold nights likely made such men feel smaller, not larger. Smaller in relation to wind, smaller beside the timber, smaller under a sky bright with stars and no warmth. Shelter did not erase that smallness. It acknowledged it. A low roof of branches is, in a way, a confession. The body needs help. The wind is stronger. The night is longer. The earth is cold. Let us make one corner less impossible. There is dignity in that confession. It is not defeat. It is intelligence without vanity. By now the shelter's fire has settled into a steadier glow. The first rush of flame is gone, and with it some of the illusion that the camp has been solved. What remains is more honest. Coals, smoke, damp edges, a roof that must be watched, a woodpile that must be guarded against the hours, and a man whose body is beginning to loosen despite itself. Outside, the cold continues to work quietly on every object it can reach. Inside, the shelter works back, not with drama, but with stubborn little adjustments. A log is turned, a robe is tucked, a boot is moved half a handspan farther from the coals. Snow is brushed from the doorway. Someone listens, waits, and decides that for the moment, nothing else has to be done. And for the moment, that is enough. Enough could last through one quiet hour, and then the sky could take it back. A storm did not always announce itself as a great wall of weather. Sometimes it came as a change in texture. The air thickened. The trees lost their sharp outlines. The sound of the camp drew closer to itself, as if the world beyond the fire had been wrapped in wool. Snow began lightly at first, almost politely, settling on the shelter roof, the woodpile, the animals' backs, the tracks around camp. A tired man might look at it and think it would pass. He might be right. He might also be very wrong. Snowfall changed shelter by weight and silence. Weight was obvious once enough of it gathered. A roof of boughs or hides could sag, a brush wall could lean, a low entrance could slowly close, a line could loosen under the pull of damp material. But silence was subtler. Snow quieted the world, and that quiet could be comforting or deceptive. The wind might drop, the fire might sound larger. Men inside could feel, for a while, as though the shelter had become safer simply because the outside had become softer. Then someone would step out and sink past the ankle, or past the calf, and understand that the night had been working very steadily. In a longer snow, the first worry was not always the roof. It might be the wood. A pile left uncovered or poorly placed could become a buried problem. Dry pieces could be hidden under a white crust. Smaller kindling could disappear entirely. Men might have to dig for what they had already worked to gather, which is one of winter's more discouraging jokes. A shelter that had seemed orderly at dusk could become a set of lumps by morning. One lump for the woodpile, one for a pack, one for a saddle, one for a bucket or kettle someone foolishly left too far from the fire. This is why experienced winter campers paid attention to where things were set down. Snow erases carelessness. A tool laid aside in ordinary weather is merely misplaced. A tool laid aside before fresh snowfall may become a treasure hunt conducted by cold hands. An axe hidden under 6 inches of snow is still an axe, but for the moment it might as well belong to a different world. A camp under snowfall needed memory. The body had to remember steps, distances, and shapes before the snow made everything equal. The shelter entrance became important in a new way. If snow drifted against it, getting out could be awkward. If the opening faced the wrong direction, wind could drive powder into the sleeping space. A hide or blanket door might stiffen, freeze along its lower edge, or collect enough snow to pull it out of shape. In the dark, pushing through such an entrance could feel like wrestling with the weather itself. A man might knock snow loose and bring half of it inside, where it melted in exactly the wrong place. Then came the familiar cycle. Brush, scrape, curse softly. Move the bedding, feed the fire, and pretend this had all been planned. The roof needed watching. A strong cabin roof could carry more than a frail brush cover, but no rough shelter deserved blind trust. Snow lying lightly on evergreen boughs could insulate, helping block wind and hold warmth. Too much snow, or wet snow, could press down until the poles bent. A man might have to reach up and thump the roof from inside, sending small avalanches sliding off the edge. This could be satisfying if done before the load grew heavy. If done too late, it could be less satisfying and much colder. In very rough shelters, a little snow coming through was not unusual. Fine powder could sift down through branches and land on blankets, hair, food, tools, and faces. It might melt near the fire and remain frozen farther back. A man could wake to tiny cold touches and at first not know whether the roof was failing or merely reminding him that it had never promised perfection. The line between a shelter and the weather was often thin, and in snowfall that line became visible. Yet snow could also help. Banked carefully around the lower walls, it sealed drafts better than loose brush. It made a shelter look half buried and, in some conditions, feel more protected. Snow against the outside could quiet the wind and make the little interior seem closer, more cave-like. A low shelter under a thick white covering might hold heat surprisingly well compared with its ugly appearance. The same snow that threatened the roof could strengthen the walls. Winter was rarely simple enough to be called only enemy. This double nature required judgment. Too little snow left drafts open. Too much could collapse, soak, or trap. Snow packed firmly might serve as a barrier. Loose powder might blow through every weakness. Wet snow could become dangerous weight. A crust could shed wind or hide empty space beneath. The mountain man, if he was paying attention, did not ask whether snow was good or bad. He asked what this snow was doing tonight. That question led back to the larger skill of reading conditions rather than memorizing rules. A shelter technique that worked in one valley might fail in another. A trick learned in dry cold might become a nuisance in damp cold. Timberline, open plains, river bottoms, foothills, and high passes all made different demands. Even within the world of mountain men, there was no single winter. There were many winters, each shaped by altitude, storm track, fuel, animals, travel purpose, and the luck of timing. This is why any honest account has to avoid turning shelter into a neat catalogue. Lean-tos, brush windbreaks, skin lodges, rough cabins, snowbanks, rock overhangs, dugouts, caves, and emergency covers all belonged somewhere in the broad world of frontier winter life. But the real story is not that men used many types of shelter. The real story is that each shelter was an answer to a question asked by a particular place at a particular hour. What do you have? What is coming? How tired are you? What must still be protected? How long do you expect to stay? What can you afford to lose? Under falling snow, those questions became quieter but sharper. The shelter felt enclosed. The firelight softened. The outside seemed to withdraw. Men might speak less because the snow made the world feel private. Someone might sit with a blanket around his shoulders, watching the entrance grow pale at its edges. Someone else might listen for animals muffled by snowfall. The kettle might make small sounds near the coals. Smoke might move more lazily in the still air, then suddenly dip if the draft changed. There could be beauty in it, and there is no need to deny that. Snow on a winter camp could make even a poor shelter look tender. The ugly brush roof became rounded. The black firewood took a white edge. Tracks softened. The noise of work faded. A man standing at the entrance might see the firelight touch falling flakes and think, for one breath, that the world had become gentle. Then the roof sagged another inch, and gentleness returned to work. That is the rhythm we keep finding. Beauty, then labour. Warmth, then smoke. Relief, then repair. The shelter never let one feeling rule for long. It taught a practical alternation, almost like breathing. Rest, notice, sleep, wake, warm, adjust, admire, fix, survive, then prepare to survive again. By deep night, the snow might have made the shelter smaller. The walls pressed inward visually, even if not physically. The roof seemed lower, the doorway narrowed. The fire became the centre of a little buried world. Beyond that world, the mountains vanished. There were no grand ridgelines, no far views, no heroic distance. Only the nearest things remained, the log at the fire's edge, the curve of a kettle, the pale fur of frost near the doorway, the dark shape of a boot, the sound of someone shifting under a robe. A man inside such a shelter might feel both protected and trapped. Protected because the snow had wrapped the camp. Trapped because every inch of weather added work for morning. He knew there would be digging, shaking, clearing, finding, drying, checking. He knew the animals would need attention. He knew the trail or trap line might be harder. But for now, the shelter asked him not to solve morning yet. Only this hour. So he listened. He let the snow fall. He let the fire settle. He watched the half-burned log brighten at the heart and blacken at the edge. If the roof held, if the coals lived, if the wind stayed patient, then the hour could pass quietly. And in winter, a quiet hour was sometimes the finest shelter anyone could build. The quiet hour could pass, but it left work behind it. By morning after a snowfall, the shelter often looked less like something built and more like something uncovered by accident. Its edges were rounded, its floors were hidden. The roof might sag under white weight, while the doorway crouched lower than before, rimmed with frost and brushed by the marks of hands pushing snow aside. The fire ring would be half buried in ash and melt, black at the centre, pale at the edges. Around it lay the night's record, a log burned hollow, a boot print frozen hard, a scattering of chips from cut wood, a place where someone had knelt to coax flame back from coals. The first task was to make the camp visible again. Shake the roof if it needed shaking. Clear the entrance. Find the woodpile. Brush snow from saddles, packs, blankets, traps, tools. Check whether anything left near the edge of the shelter had frozen into the ground. A strap might have to be warmed before it would bend. A kettle might be stuck in a little skirt of ice. A hide door might crackle when lifted. The shelter had passed the night, yes, but now it had to be returned to usefulness. There is a kind of morning discouragement particular to snow country. You do yesterday's work again before today's work can begin. The wood gathered with effort has to be dug free. The path beaten to the animals has to be opened again. The place where gear was arranged must be relearned under a new surface. Snow makes the world clean for the eye and messy for the hands. It smooths everything except responsibility. For men whose work required movement, fresh snow could be both information and obstruction. Tracks became readable for a while, if the light and surface were right. Animals left marks that could matter. Human movement, too, became written plainly across the ground. But travel became slower, and every step cost more. A trapline that had been hard yesterday might become twice as tiring. A route to water could vanish beneath soft drift. A slope that was passable at dusk might be treacherous under the new layer. The shelter, then, did not merely protect the night. It became the base from which the day's new difficulty was measured. Inside, after snow, dampness often increased. Clothing that had seemed dry might have taken moisture from the air. Snow kicked into the entrance melted near the fire. Roof edges dripped where heat touched them. Bedding needed shaking, or replacing if enough boughs remained available. A man might reach under a robe and find the lower layer cold where it had pressed against the ground. He might sit up slowly, feeling for the dry places first, because in winter the body learned not to trust surfaces. The old bough bed, after several nights, would flatten. Its spring went out. Needles shed. Stems pressed through. What had once lifted the body from frozen ground slowly became part of the ground's argument. Replacing it took time, and time competed with everything else. Yet neglecting it carried its own cost. A poor bed meant poorer sleep. Poorer sleep meant slower work. Slower work meant worse shelter tomorrow. In cold weather, comfort and efficiency were not opposites. Sometimes comfort was simply maintenance by another name. This is one of the deeper truths hidden in these shelters. A little warmth was not indulgence. A little dryness was not softness. A better bed was not laziness. These were tools for keeping the human machine able to continue. The frontier myth often makes hardship seem morally improving by itself, as if cold automatically made a man stronger. In practice, cold wore people down. The skilled person did not worship discomfort. He reduced it where he could, because unnecessary misery spent strength needed elsewhere. That is why the old camps were full of small improvements. A raised sleeping place if poles could be spared, a better windbreak after a bad night, more chinking in a cabin wall, a wider smoke opening after too many coughing hours, a better place to hang wet clothing, a roof edge trimmed so snow would slide away more cleanly. None of these improvements made life easy. They made life less wasteful. They kept the body from paying the same tax every night. A rough cabin, after snow, revealed this clearly. Its roofline might hold drifts. Its wall cracks might show white where powder had entered. Its chimney or smoke opening might behave differently under still weather. Men inside could hear snow sliding from the roof in heavy sighs. The door could jam against accumulation outside. A window, if there was one, might be only a dim patch of cold light. The cabin protected better than a lean-to, but it also collected problems of its own. A structure that lasted long enough became responsible for its failures. In a temporary shelter, a man might abandon the floor by leaving. In a winter cabin, he had to live with it or fix it. That difference changed the mind. A poor lean-to could be endured with the promise that tomorrow's camp might be better. A poor cabin was an accusation repeated every morning. The draught by the wall, the smoke that would not draw, the drip near the bedding, the place where the door scraped, the uneven floor, the corner where food had to be kept despite dampness. Longer shelter made irritation durable, and durable irritation became a form of architecture no one planned. Yet longer shelter also allowed memory to become protection. Men learned the cabin's moods. They knew when snow needed clearing before the roof protested. They knew how much wood the night would demand in certain weather. They knew who slept poorly near the draught, and who could be trusted to wake when the fire sank. They learned that the low corner flooded in thaw, that the west wall smoked in a certain wind, that the door needed clearing before dawn after heavy snow. Experienced domesticated inconvenience without removing it. In mobile camps, the learning had to travel inside the person instead of inside the building. The man carried forward not the structure, but the memory of what had worked. Do not set the bedding so low when snow is banked there. Do not trust that kind of roof under wet snow. Do not leave the axe outside when the sky goes soft. Do not let the best dry kindling vanish in the first cheerful blaze. Save some for morning, always morning. Winter survival was shaped by the needs of a person you had not yet become, the colder, stiffer, more impatient version of yourself at dawn. That future self was easy to betray at night. He was not present to complain yet. He could not object when the tired evening self said the woodpile was probably enough. The boots were close enough to the fire. The roof could wait. The snow would not amount to much. The tool would be easy to find. Then dawn came, and the future self arrived to collect every debt. A good shelter builder worked partly out of mercy toward that future self. This mercy could be as simple as placing the axe where snow would not cover it, laying one more log within reach, turning damp footwear before sleep, shaking loose snow from the roof before it froze into a heavier crust, or pulling gear farther inside even though the body wanted rest. These actions had no audience. No one would sing about them, but they created mornings that began with fewer curses, and that was a genuine historical achievement. Outside, after the storm, the mountains might shine with an almost unfair beauty. Snow loaded the branches. The air cleared. The sky opened blue and cold above the timber. Smoke rose from the shelter in a thin, uncertain line. The camp looked peaceful from a distance, perhaps even lovely. But inside that loveliness, hands were sorting, thawing, scraping, shaking, tying and preparing. The beautiful morning still had to be worked through. The fire log at the mouth of the shelter, burned down to a black curve, might be rolled aside to make room for fresh fuel. Under it, a little heat remained in the ash, faint but real. Someone would kneel close, arrange splinters, breathe carefully, and wait for the first small flame to take. Around him, the shelter emerged from snow, one practical detail at a time. And with each detail restored, the night became history. And once the night became history, it did not quite disappear. It stayed in the flattened boughs, in the ash pressed into snow, in the wet edge of a blanket, in the place where a man's knee had packed the ground while he worked the fire back to life. It stayed in the memory of what failed and what held. The next camp would be different, because no two nights offered exactly the same materials, weather, strength, or luck. But something from this shelter would travel onward in the body, a habit, a caution, a dislike of low ground in certain weather, a sharper respect for dry kindling, a private promise not to leave boots where morning could harden them into little punishments. That is how winter knowledge accumulated, not as a neat book of rules, but as a collection of remembered discomforts. The roof that sagged, the fire that smoked, the snow wall that melted inward, the beautiful campsite that turned into a cold basin after dark, the companion who had been right about the wind and irritatingly calm about it, the night when an extra armload of wood saved everyone from getting up too often, the morning when a hidden axe cost half an hour and every minute of it felt personal. A mountain man carried these lessons as surely as he carried tools. Some were learned from older travellers, some from native companions, families, and communities whose knowledge of place reached far deeper than any one trapper's experience. Some came from trade networks and shared wintering habits. Some came from mistakes that no one needed to repeat aloud because the body remembered them without ceremony. Shelter building was not a single skill. It was a memory system made of weather, labour, materials, and humility. The coldest winters stripped away the boastful parts of survival. They did not care whether a man liked to think of himself as hard, free, independent, or brave. They asked simpler questions. Can you keep your bedding dry enough? Can you keep the fire breathing? Can you see where the wind will go before it gets there? Can you stop before dark, even when pride wants another mile? Can you protect your feet, your powder, your animals, your tools, your sleep? Can you accept a shelter that looks poor if it works, and abandon a handsome idea if the weather proves it wrong? Those questions do not sound like legend. They sound like chores. But they are the real architecture of endurance. The shelters themselves were rarely meant to become part of the permanent record. A lean-to might collapse under the next storm. A brush wall might sink into spring mud. A snow-banked windbreak might vanish with the thaw. A rough cabin might stand longer, smoke darkened and patched, then fall slowly into rot, reuse, firewood, or memory. Even when one survived, it could not fully explain the nights it had held. A wall can show its notches and cracks, but not the hour when someone woke in smoke and decided whether to rise. A hearth can show ash, but not the relief of finding coals alive. A bed of old boughs can show where someone lay, but not the cold that made him turn again and again toward the fire. That is why the quiet details matter. They let us enter the shelter at the proper scale, not as tourists admiring frontier toughness from a safe distance, but as listeners, noticing what a body needed to get through one more night. A wall behind the back, a roof low enough to hold a little warmth, boughs under the hip, a robe around the shoulders, fuel within reach, a doorway that did not invite all the wind in, smoke that could escape, at least most of the time, a place for wet things to become less wet, a place for tools to remain usable, a place where the world outside could be reduced from endless winter to a circle of manageable tasks. There was comfort in that, even now. Not because the life was easy. It was not. Not because the cold made people noble. Cold is not generous enough for that. But because the shelters show human beings doing something ancient and recognizable, making a small boundary against what is too large, taking branches, hides, logs, snow, ash, and tired hands, and arranging them into a temporary permission to rest. The mountain men of the American West lived within a world shaped by commerce, colonial expansion, native homelands, mixed families, trade goods, violence, cooperation, debt, hunger, ambition, and weather. Their shelters cannot be separated from that world. They were not fairy tale huts in empty wilderness. They were practical spaces inside a complicated history. But inside the shelter, when the night was cold enough, all that complexity narrowed to the same human fact. The body needed warmth, the fire needed wood, the roof needed watching, morning needed to be reached. And morning, when it came, did not always arrive with triumph. More often, it arrived as work in grey light. A man sat up slowly. Someone cleared the entrance. Someone coaxed the fire. Someone found the axe, or failed to find it quickly and learned again. Animals shifted beyond the shelter. Snow slid from branches. The sky brightened over ridges that had not cared at all whether people slept well beneath them. The shelter, so important in darkness, already began to look temporary in daylight. That temporary quality is the final tenderness of it. A shelter could save a night and still leave almost nothing behind. It could hold a person through wind, smoke, snow, and exhaustion, then become a scatter of poles, a blackened fire ring, and a shallow impression in the ground. It could be forgotten by maps and omitted from heroic stories. It could vanish before anyone thought to name it. Yet for the hours when it mattered, it was the difference between exposure and endurance, between panic and patience, between the whole winter and just this one manageable darkness. So when we imagine how mountain men built shelters during America's coldest winters, perhaps we should not picture only the finished thing. We should picture the choosing before dark, the first cut of the axe, the awkward dragging of a pole, the boughs laid with more care than pride would admit, the snow packed along the base, the robe hung against the draft, the smoke finding the eyes, the boot moved away from sparks, the hand reaching out at midnight to turn a half-burned log, the silence afterward, when the flame catches again and the shelter seems to breathe with the person inside it. Then, finally, the morning. The storm has passed, or perhaps only paused. The fire has burned low. The roof is white with snow, darker underneath where smoke touched it all night. The bedding is flattened. The air smells of ash, pine, damp wool, leather, and cold. A man steps out, stiff but moving, and looks back at the little structure that carried him through the dark. It is not impressive. It is not grand. It is hardly even a room, but near its mouth lies the black curve of the fire log, split open, faintly warm beneath the ash. Around it, snow has melted and frozen again, in rough shapes made by boots, knees, hands, and hooves. The shelter is already beginning to lose itself to daylight. Soon the camp will move, or the weather will cover it, or spring will take it apart, piece by piece. For now, though, it has done enough. And in the long story of winter, enough is a beautiful word.